most of my career, about 30 years, looking at twins and identical twins. And I got really interested in not so much the similarities, but the dissimilarities. Everyone just focused on, habits and the way you guys pick up a coffee cup or a beer or, laugh or smile. But people don't focus on things like twins getting aging at different rates or dying at different times or getting different cancers or one being depressed, one being happy, etc. So I was really fascinated to try and work out, if you could crack that in twins, it would generalize to the rest of the population because you guys are a unique natural experiment that you can only do in mice and rats.
I like mice and rats. It's great.
You're lab rats really, because you couldn't. You'd have to crossbreed humans and then get them to live in exactly the same place for a third of their life, and then see what happened to them. So it's fantastic that nature allows this to happen, and we can do these amazing experiments on real people that should inform everybody about nature and nurture and why stuff happens to us. And so that was really my.
And what were the general findings of it? Like, what was it? Was it that lifestyle and obviously epigenetics resulted in different predisposition towards certain chronic diseases? Well,
the average, if you just look across, hundreds of diseases, it's about 50-50.
Okay. Between nature and nurture.
50% nurture, 50% nature.
Wow.
Or 50% genetics, 50% environment. And there are a few exceptions, but broadly that's around it. But for things like aging, the rate of aging or age-related disease, it was less. And things like cancer, it's much less. It's around 20% genetics and 80% environment. So that was always interesting. So I was trying to look for what was different about identical twins that would explain this, because your clones, you have the same genes, the same DNA in every cell in your body, and you virtually had identical lifestyles for a couple of decades. So any differences between you could be really significant. And we looked at epigenetics first, because obviously the genes are the same, but these little chemicals that can sit on top of your genes that can switch them on and off. And in that book, Identically Different, I did sort of discuss a few ideas about why that made some twins different. And it might be due to emotional traumas or big things that happen in the life of kids, particularly, that send them on different pathways, which could be due to these little chemicals which can change personality or other areas. But those differences were relatively small. So there were a few anecdotes. In that book, I did look at, for example, at homosexuality and why identical twins often are discordant for sexuality, which is kind of weird as well.
Wow.
As in one was heterosexual and one might be homosexual.
Yeah, which you wouldn't expect to be very common, but it is quite common. And that was fascinating. So thinking there might have been some change, or in the womb, again, some of these epigenetic signals, these little chemicals are just changed around. And I think really interesting, philosophical, to think, well, we could have been, someone quite different, but for a few chemicals floating around at different times. And same is true for diseases as well, or autoimmune disease or things like this. So that was fascinating to me. But I then I came across, I guess, around that same time, about 12 years ago, the idea of the microbiome. And I was fascinated to see if this community of microbes in our gut were similar or different in twins. Were they mainly genetic? Did you acquire them and, they followed you around because you had the right genes? That means that, they liked your intestines, and more than someone else's, so they stuck with them. In which case, identical twins should have identical microbiomes. And it turns out that you don't. You really only slightly genetic. You're only slightly more similar than unrelated people, which is really interesting.
Wow, that we're not ridiculously similar. I wonder if this is true, because a friend, I had lunch with a friend, and he was a scientist of the microbiome, and he said that I'm like, as identical twins, he said I'm probably more microbial, similar to my wife, because we share the same home, the same environment, we sleep in the same bed. And you're probably more identical, like Stephen being my identical twin, he's more identically, like microbiome is more identical to his wife because they live in different homes. Is that correct?
That is probably correct, yeah. We've done studies on that with twins, and certainly the household is really important, and even your dog. You'll share microbes with your dog.
Yeah, I've got
that
cats.
I think are really important. So if you share wives and dogs, then it gets more similar. But,
we don't, just to clarify.
We won't go
that.
there on this one. That's the late night one. So for me, a big aha moment in this science career was finding out that identical twins like you had very different gut microbiomes. So suddenly, I had a mechanism by which, all these common diseases, even personality traits, and it could be explained by having different microbes, because of this new understanding of what the gut microbes are, which really they're like a new organ in the body which produces chemicals. They're like a massive chemical factory. And if that factory is different, you're going to be producing different chemicals to your brother.
That sit on top of the genes and therefore influence epigenetics.
Yeah, there's 500 times more genes in your gut microbes than there are in your cells. So we have a much bigger catalog, if you like, of chemicals we can produce from our gut microbes in response to food than we have inherently in our bodies. And that's why we've co-evolved. So we've got this huge extra diversity that's been given to us by in a way forming a little home for our gut microbes. So that's really interesting. So in a way, twins are much less similar than we thought they were before we discovered gut microbes 10 years ago. And I think, you guys probably know more than anyone that you are more different than people think you are. And everyone assumes you're just these clones that do everything the same way. And I think now you've got a bit of science to explain why that is, you can eat the same foods. And we did this with the Zoe Predict studies. You will react very differently. So often you react differently to the same stress. And part of that is because all these chemicals you're producing are going to be different. And I think that's fascinating.